Things that we don't have time to deal with, but the things that we can talk about, we will. I'm going to spend a good bit of tonight introducing the book to you, because I think if you have a proper understanding of what's taking place, the book of Revelation is unlike any book of the Bible, even unlike any book of the New Testament. It is a very unusual type of book. It's filled with a lot of things that are strange, that people abuse. It's sometimes confusing to people and sometimes frightening to people. But it is a fabulous book. And it is a book of hope, a book of promise. It is a book that ends very well. And it also is very practical. A lot of practicality in this book. And there are times when we just need a little assurance, whenever times get tough, that you know what, in the end it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. And that's really what the book is about. On page 2 of the notes that you have, there are a number of books. Many of these are written by members of the church. This is not on your syllabus. Maybe it is on the syllabus. Yes, on the syllabus, the books that have been written. David Roper's book, he has 2 volumes on the book of Revelation. Put out the Truth for Today commentary. Edward Myers, After These Things I Saw. Published by College Press. He was a longtime teacher at Searcy, Arkansas at Harding. W.B. West.
Let me clarify something. The list of books that he's mentioning, Phil has given us a second syllabus we're going to marry with this, so if you're leaving me your email address back here, I'm going to email you that second copy of the syllabus, and that has the authors that he's mentioning right now.
Okay. W.B. West, a person that I knew, wrote a book, and it's a devotional type book on the book of Revelation. Very fine. Stafford North has written several things on the subject. Wayne Jackson has a commentary. One of the most important books that really led to a lot of other books is Ray Summers' book, Worthy is the Lamb. He is not a member of the Church of Christ, but his book, his commentary, opened up the eyes of an awful lot of people and made sense of this book. And so many of these other books that I'm mentioning, written by members of the church, really refer back to the things that he wrote. J.W. Roberts has a commentary in the Sweet Publishing. Burton Kaufman has his book. Frank Pack, who was at Pepperdine for many years, has a book, parts 1 and 2, in the Living Word, just little bitty thin books. And Farrell Jenkins has one, and then also Gary Witcher. Donald Taylor, one of the professors at Freed-Hardeman, put out a book on this, which is very, very good. There are other various people who put out various things that are mentioned on that, and I'll not go into a great deal more. But I do think that it's valuable to know that this book actually has been studied by members of the church. And many of the books that I'm referring to have been written in the last 25 years. Those of you who remember Y2K, the 2000, all of that, spurred a lot of interest in the future. And many of our brethren wrote books on the book of Revelation because of that, because they wanted to try to deaden some of the hype and some of the silliness that people were coming out. A lot of religious groups use this book, that is the book of Revelation, for a lot of different things. Hal Lindsey's book, written in the 1970s, The Late Great Planet Earth, was the largest it had the largest publication, the largest circulation of any book written in that decade, religious book. Everybody wanted to read it, and it had a whole lot of things that were very much premillennial. It had a lot of things about helicopters and all kinds of things that they were trying to take things from that, and it created quite a stir, and that book is still very, very popular. Hal Lindsey later on was also involved with others in writing a book called Left Behind, and that went into a series of movies, a series of other programs. And all of this, of course, was very much premillennial and what we would call futurist, a futurist interpretation of the book of Revelation. But it stirred a lot of people, and even to this day, you have a lot of people who have all kinds of crazy ideas about various passages in the book of Revelation that do not really fit the context or the historical background of the book. And that's what we will be looking at. The book of Revelation is a different kind of literature. It's what's called apocalyptic literature. And we'll talk about that at length in a little bit. But this was actually very common in 100 years before the time of Christ and up to 100 years afterward. For about 200 years, there was an awful lot of literature that came out that would be called apocalyptic literature. And some, unfamiliar with this type of literature, believe that there's some deep, dark secret behind every little detail. Frankly, those who hold the futurist interpretation of the book of Revelation have kind of fostered this notion and put it out that there's some kind of secret thing behind this and that, and they try to look for things beyond what's in there. Many of the things in the book of Revelation, to be very honest, are not there so much for detail as they are for what I would call coloring. In other words, they set the stage. They set the stage. They're not the focus, but they help you to understand and to see what's most important, setting the stage behind the scenes. And we'll look at several things that are just like that, that I think are very valuable. Frankly, those who hold this futurist interpretation of Revelation have made so many mistakes and made so many predictions that did not come to be true. It is amazing. I'm old enough to remember back when there was a guy in Oklahoma City, and he would read some passage, and he would say, "Oh, this is what this passage is saying." And you go 20 years later, and he looks at the same passage, and he would say something completely different. He says, "Oh, this is what this passage is saying." Well, he didn't say either one of them. I do not know of anything in the book of Revelation that has anything to do with the 20th century America or 21st century America. I don't know of anything that has to do with the Middle East. You see, a lot of things that are said in this book are just flat things that really have nothing to do with this modern period of time. And this is one of the things that I think is very, very helpful. Now, most people in America have a notion of the futurist view of Revelation. Part of that is because of all of those little booklets that have been put out by the Jehovah's Witnesses for the last 100 to 20 years or so. And many people began to believe this stuff. And even some of the major denominational churches that once did not believe in premillennialism came to be premillennialist. A lot of your Pentecostal, a lot of your Baptist churches are now premillennial, where they weren't prior to 1930. Lots of changes. There was actually quite a number of people, and there are still some churches up in Kentucky that are premillennial to this day. But much of the premillennial doctrine was shown to be false back in the 30s and 40s by a number of different individuals. And I'm thankful that they were able to help us to see the truth about the New Testament and the fact that we don't have to be premillennial to believe that there are some predictions in the Bible. Now, whenever you have a drama, there is one plot. And that plot, in that plot, the authors try to create the mood surrounding the story. And there's a lot of that takes place in the book of Revelation. Now, in the Old Testament, God's appearances are coordinated with moods, sometimes with lightning and thunder and trumpets and clouds. Well, some of those things in the Old Testament are borrowed in the New Testament. We'll talk about that a little more in a little bit. Well, these mood items instill fear and reverence in the hearts of those who follow God. And so it is with the book of Revelation. Now, the revelator is not John. The revelator is Jesus Christ. And we'll see that very clearly as we study the text itself. The English title, Revelation, comes from the Latin word revelatio, which in its verb form means to reveal or to unveil something that had been previously hidden. It was hidden, but now it's made clear. The Greek term, apocalypsis, is taken from the first word in the text. And so sometimes it's called the apocalypse, or apocalypsis. Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, these are people who lived in the 2nd and 3rd century. Hippolytus, Victorinus, Origen, and Jerome all point to John, the apostle, the brother of James, the son of Zebedee, as the author. And the writer calls himself John 4 times. Chapter 1, verse 1, then in verse 4, verse 9, and then at the end of the book, in chapter 22, verse 8. Now, John speaks with the authority of a prophet, as a prophet, and of course also as an apostle. And there are a lot of similarities that exist between Revelation and other writings from John. Both use the term logos, or word, in referring to Jesus. Jesus is the Word, Revelation 19:13, as well as John 1:1. He's the Lamb. He's the water of life. It's He that overcomes. He's the one who keeps the commandments. And John wrote from the Isle of Patmos, where he was on exile. This is in chapter 1. And this island is off the coast of Asia Minor, and he's writing to the 7 churches. Now, one of the things that I want to point out is when you're reading various things in the New Testament, and various places are cited, these are always real places. You can go there. You can see the things that are there. I have been able and privileged to go to Israel. And I've been to Bethlehem and Jerusalem and the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea. And I've seen a number of other things as well. But all of those things are exciting because the Bible is about real events with real places and real people who lived. The Biblical Archaeological Review put out various types of things in recent years. And one of them that they put out is 50 people mentioned in the Bible that really did exist. And they have found evidence of these people from archaeology. And of course, when you add in the early writings of the early church fathers, these are people who knew that these people really did exist. Christianity is an historical event, an historical belief. And so I'm thankful that whenever we start reading a lot of these things, one of the things that we have to come away from is saying, look, this book is not like the Book of Mormon that mentioned a whole bunch of cities nobody's ever found. Okay? It's not. It's a place. Do you know that there is no record of Mecca prior to about 900 AD? And yet, Muhammad was supposed to be in Mecca, and it was supposed to be some great center back in the early 600s. But we don't have any record of a Mecca until the 800s or 900s. There's not a map, ancient map, anywhere in the world where you can look and see Mecca until hundreds of years after Muhammad. Yes. Many other problems. What I'm saying to you is that the Bible is believable. And even the book of Revelation and the things that are mentioned is believable. All of these places, these 7 churches of Asia, man, you can go to Turkey today and find these places. They still exist. And they are real places. And I just wanted to mention that aspect. Now, no book of the New Testament is more variously interpreted and abused and misunderstood than the book of Revelation. And that's what causes sometimes people to ignore it and other times to be wondering, well, what is all this about? Now, scholars and those who've studied the book understand it to be apocalyptic literature, and I'll describe that in just a little bit. Apocalyptic literature was popular among the Jews from 200 BC to 200 AD. That's more time than I've mentioned, but most of them in the middle part. But writers used scenes from the Old Testament, scenes that people would be familiar with. The Jews, whenever they heard about this phrase or that phrase, that would conjure up a picture in their mind of something that took place back in the past. But they were using a past event to try to dramatize something taking place in the present. But the people knew what was being talked about. Now, if I were talking about a certain thing, if I were talking about Joe DiMaggio and Babe Ruth and others, some people might think of the Yankees. They were Yankees, weren't they? I don't know. Maybe some of the older guys will remember. But you think about that and some of the things, or if you think about the Alamo. Oh, the Alamo. I've been there. Not really very impressive as a building, but boy, it was really quite something. Remember the Alamo. People, that resonated with people's minds. If we talk about the Civil War, North or South, there's all kinds of things that draw people's attention where they remember. I lived in Franklin, Tennessee for 13 and a half years. And the most bloody battle in Tennessee took place in Franklin. There was 8,600 casualties in one night. It was the bloodiest day of any battle in the Civil War. 5 generals died. Well, most people don't know much about the Battle of Franklin. But if you were talking about Appomattox, why, everybody knows that's where the war ended. Or if you talk about Dealey Plaza, what happened in Dealey Plaza? Anybody alive in 1963 knows that's where John Kennedy was shot. I was in the 7th grade. I've been to Dealey Plaza. And they have a little X on the window where Lee Harvey Oswald was shooting from. All kinds of things. We see the Old Testament is so much used. Now, what's interesting about the book of Revelation is that there is not a single whole verse quoted in the book of Revelation. But out of the 404 verses that are in this book, 278 of them, yes, 278 of them are referring back what we call allusions to the Old Testament. Now, we'll talk about why in just a little bit. The writers used those scenes from the Old Testament to express something to the people who were readers, because you see there were enough Jews in the churches that they could explain what was going on. The people who got the letters knew what was happening. But because we are Westerners in the United States in the 21st century, some of those things that would have been so evident to the people of that time are not evident to us. How would they have understood it? That's the question. How would they understand various passages found in the book? And we will emphasize this again and again. Now, Revelation is full of passages that contain references, as I mentioned, but none are exact quotations of the whole verse. And what they are is reapplications of various events that took place in the Old Testament. And they try to make it for a current situation. What is the book of Revelation? Well, one of the things it is a circular letter. By that I mean that it came from Jesus through his messengers. The word angelos, angel, also means messenger. Same word. Angel, the meaning of that word in Greek, angelos, is messenger. And that's what an angel was a messenger. And Each of them had their own that they would take, but the whole book went to all of them. If you lived in Ephesus, you'd find out what was going on in Laodicea and Thyatira. You'd know what was happening in Pergamum and Smyrna. You would know all about those things. So it was a circular letter of those churches. Number 2 was a book of prophecy. Yes, there is a lot of prediction. Some of the prediction are things that would take place very quickly, very soon. But some of the predictions would take place after a long time. And when we get into Saturday, I'll be explaining that aspect of it. There is one aspect of the book of Revelation that every person sitting in this room, you will one day be there. You will be there. We'll talk about that later. What is the nature of apocalyptic literature? Well, the book of Revelation is one of many examples of this type of literature. And whenever you've studied Jewish literature like this, and a lot of scholars did, it began to help them to understand a little bit about this book and the kind of things that was in it. Basically, apocalyptic literature was literature that was written from Jews to other Jews to encourage them during a time of really harsh persecution, difficulty, lots of difficulties. And what they wanted to do by giving this literature to them was to give them some hope, to encourage them, so that they could live through this difficult time. Now, some other apocalyptic books are the Book of Jubilees, 1st Enoch, 2nd Baruch, 4th Ezra, the War Scroll from Qumran, the Shepherd of Hermas, the Apocalypse of Paul, and the Apocalypse of Peter. Well, those are not books that many people are very familiar with. Some of these are books that people say, oh, those are the lost books of the Bible. They were never the lost books of the Bible. They were rejected. They were never, many of those books never claimed to be inspired. They were just written kind of like a book that I would write. I'm not inspired. If I wrote a book to encourage people, I hope it would do that job. Well, they were just trying to encourage one another. It was a human book, even though they used the names like Paul and Peter. Why did they do that? Well, this is what's known as pseudepigrapha. That is, they had a false name, a false writing. If I had Paul's name and put it on it, it might get a bigger circulation, or Peter's name on it might get a bigger circulation. So things like Barnabas and these other things, they did it in order to get attention, but they were never considered to be inspired. These were tracts for hard times, for difficult times. Some chapters like Luke 17 or 2 Thessalonians 2 is somewhat like this, somewhat like apocalyptic literature. It's kind of not easy to understand. There are things in it that are not going to be easily grasped. And so that's the way it is. But one of the things that we need to know about the book of Revelation is that the purpose is to show that God is going to win in the end. And when you read Revelation 17 and verse 14, that even though the people of God and Jesus are going to be attacked, Jesus is the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and He's going to win. And the people who are with Him are going to win. And really this is the main message of this particular book. Now, apocalyptic literature uses symbols or signs. Signs. And I want you to keep that word sign in your mind. We will come to it when we start looking into the text. God gave him these things, the things to show to His bondservants, the things which must shortly take place. And He sent and He communicated. Well, this is right in the first couple of verses. He communicated. Well, in Greek, the word for communicate here is the word for sign. He gave them signs. My teacher, Hugo McCord, whenever he was discussing this, he said, well, what they were doing was they were signified. These things were signified. That is communicated by signs. And that's what this book is about. And it was given to the angel, by his angel, to his bondservant John. So you've got Jesus giving it from the Father to Jesus, from Jesus the Revelator to the angel, from the angel to John, and John then wrote it down. But actually this is the revelation of Jesus Christ. And it is using signs. And sometimes this word communicated by itself is rather figurative. The Bible uses lots of figures of speech, and we'll be looking at those in more detail in just a little bit. And these figures of speech are symbolic, but they have a meaning. And if you know the meaning, it helps you to understand the book. And on the next couple of pages, we'll have some charts that help us to see what these things that were signs, what they actually meant from the text. None of this is something I made up. This is something that was well known among the Jews. Lots of figures of speech. Now, apocalyptic literature is kind of code communication. Well, what is a code communication? Well, if it's wartime, all nations, the Allies and the Americans, and the ones that were with them, the Allies and then the Germans had their own codes and the Allies had their own codes. If you've seen the movie about the wind talkers, about those of the Native Americans who could speak a language that nobody in Germany understood, well, they could talk their language and understand one another. But the Germans didn't know what they were talking about because they didn't know the language. Code communication is a type of language where you're expressing some notion or idea or concept that you want your brother who speaks your language to know. But you don't want your enemies to know. Let's remember Christianity, as we'll see, was illegal. Illegal in the first century. And they were under tremendous persecution. So in order for them to communicate with one another, you communicate in a way where the guy that you're communicating to, he knows exactly what you're talking about. But your enemies who didn't know Jewish literature, they didn't understand. They thought it was a bunch of gibberish and nonsense. That was what the book of Revelation was really partially about, this code language. Now, if the persecutors found this apocalyptic message, it wouldn't mean anything to them because they couldn't understand it. So this would this would allow the people to remain safe, or a little safer, at this particular point in time. Okay, if you have various defined symbols, for instance, we'll see 7 stars mentioned in 120. These are angels. By the way, all of this will be in your printed material. Then you have the lampstands, or the lamps, and these are 7 spirits of God. The eyes, another place in chapter 5, verse 6, are 7 spirits of God who see everything. Then you have various thing about the bowls, or bowls of incense, or the prayers of the people. Or the red dragon is referred to as Satan. Or the heads of things were mountains. Or 10 horns were actually 10 kings. Or the various waters were people. Sometimes it talks about the woman when we get later in the book, and this is talking about the great city, which I understand to be Jerusalem. Then there is the fine linen. These would be righteous deeds. And then there is the lake of fire, which is called the second death. So you see, you have one phrase that means one thing if you take it literally, but actually it's symbolic in referring to something else. A lot of animals are mentioned. Sheep and cows. Well, sometimes these are not sheep and cows, these are the people of God. Sometimes you have violent people like goats and lions and beasts and dragons. And these are usually the enemies of God and His people. Sometimes Christ, He is spoken of as the Lamb from the tribe of Judah. Well, that comes right out of Genesis chapter 49. And then you have other various things about him. He's the lamb. You know, the lamb that was silent before it shivered. Isaiah 53. Jesus is introduced by John the Baptist. Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. A bit of a reference to Isaiah 53, where the Lord laid upon him, that is this Lamb, the sins of us all. So you have those kinds of things. Then you have the word horn, sometimes powers, sometimes rulers. You have a seal. We'll look at a seal, a kind of a sign of ownership. Sometimes there is a trumpet. That's usually for warning. Sometimes you have a bowl pouring out of wrath. Sometimes you have the word key, and usually this is talking about power or authority. And we'll see in one place it's talking about the power to open and close. So those things are there. They're various symbols drawn from the Old Testament. The tree of life, the hidden manna, the rod of iron, the morning star, the key of David, living creatures, the four horsemen, the mighty angel, the cloud, the rainbow, all kinds of things. Numbers. A lot of times numbers are not to be taken literally, but figuratively and symbolically. The number one would be unity or independent existence. Two would have strength and energy, courage. Ecclesiastes 9 verse 4, two are better than one. Well, there's strength there. The number three, well, that would be a reference to deity or to God or heaven. You know, sometimes the third heaven where God is. Sometimes you have the word four. Well, the four corners, the four winds, four angels, four horsemen. This is just talking about everything. You know, the whole gamut. Five. Well, you got 5 fingers and 5 toes. Well, I guess one's a thumb, but I guess it's a funny finger, but it's still a finger.
Yeah.
But you have 5 fingers and 5 toes. This is well rounded with all of the members intact. And then you have 6. 6 is 1 less than 7. And 6 is looked at as sinister, evil. Since it's short of 7, it lacks something. It fails to measure up to 7. It's not great enough. And it's somewhat like our number 13. You know, it's not good. Not good. 7. What is 7? 7 is 3 plus 4. That's heaven and earth. Everything. And 7 days of the week. 7 is that kind of, there's kind of a completeness to that. Then the number 10 is even more than that, the number of completeness. 10 commandments. 12 has a lot of meaning to it. 3 times 4 equals 12. That's organized completeness. There are 12 tribes. There were 12 apostles. We'll look at 12 times 12, which is 144. But usually when we get to 144, we're thinking about 144,000. Well, what is 1,000? 1,000 is 10 times 10 times 10. And many times the word 1,000 is a high multiple that's almost uncountable. Almost uncountable. And whenever you see the word 1,000, it's not always literal. For instance, Psalm 50 and verse 10 about how that God owns all the cattle on 1,000 hills. Well, my goodness, Tennessee and Alabama and Georgia put together would have over 1,000 hills. That'd be a small part. It's not just 1,000. It would be all the hills, all the cattle on all the hills belong to God. And sometimes you have multiples. If 6 is evil, then 66 is even eviler than 6. And 666 is, evil to a great extent. As evil as you can get. When you have multiples, something is increased and intensified. Then there is the word myriad. The word myriad means 10,000. And there is the section where we will talk about myriads of angels. 10,000 times 10,000, that's a whole bunch. Maybe one of you guys can figure out how much that is. I think it's 100 million, but I could be wrong. 10,000 times 10,000, that's a bunch. When we talk about the word literal, someone said, well, what do you believe? Well, I believe in literal translation. But literal translation doesn't mean that everything has to literally mean what it means. If you have something that is figurative, a literal translation takes into account something that is figurative and treats it as figurative. That's literal translation. We'll stop here at this particular point. We've made good progress. We will come back and we will look at some other things that I think are important, and we'll also talk about some principles for interpreting. Now, folks, this introduction is lasting a long time. Believe me, you will thank me, because this will help explain a whole lot of things when we get to it. So we're taking a lot of time doing the opening part of it. Okay, it's 6:51 according to this. Do I go 2 more minutes and then quit? Okay, I'm going to go 2 more minutes. But I do want to mention to you that the literal approach always recognizes the fact of the use of symbolism and always recognizes the fact that something is future. Now, how many ways can you use the word run? You know, if you run, you see somebody running now, you think of them going pretty fast, more than walking. But what about when your nose runs? What about when an engine runs? What about when a politician runs for office? How many different ways can you use the word run? A whole bunch. A whole bunch. And what I'm saying to you is that the context, a literal interpretation, always considers the context. And it is the context that is the final determinant of the meaning of any word. This is why whenever you're reading the Bible and you run across a word that is used in a figurative way, what is the context? I used to ask my students to go through the book of 1 Corinthians and look at the word body. It's used numerous times. And tell me what every one of those words meant. Sometimes it was the body of Christ, sometimes it was your body, sometimes it was the body of Christ, which is the church. But it's used in a host of different ways. And learning how to distinguish those things are very important. And that's a part of being a good student of the Word of God. Okay, we'll stop here at this point and we'll come back in a little bit.